Welcome back to Doug Pagitt Radio on AM 950 here in the Twin Cities, in a conversation with Bishop John Shelby Spong, the author of his newest release called Eternal Life, A New Vision Beyond Religion, Beyond Theism, Beyond Heaven and Hell. And before the break, Bishop Spong, I'd asked you about this use of language, and you saying people don't take it literally and ought not to take it literally. These stories of the Bible and the language of religious faith, that they ought to take it in some other ways. So I want to talk with you some more about that. And in some ways, you've created a bit of a polemic in your title to your book and the subtitle, wanting to get beyond theism and religion and heaven and hell. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on how that affects the conversation that you're trying to have with people who might not know that there's a safe place beyond sort of a literal, exacting kind of language when it comes to religion and faith, and what it means for people who are trying to press beyond all this.
Well, let me begin by saying that if you study the gospel tradition deeply enough, you will learn some basic things. One is that none of the gospel was written until the second to third generation after Jesus. None of them are written by eyewitnesses. All of them are written in a language Jesus didn't speak. So that you've got to trace an oral tradition from 40 years to 70 years, and you've got to translate it into a different language before you and I can read the first word. So you ought to be very careful about being literal. Secondly, if you know how the Bible came to be written, it was a liturgical book, the New Testament. When Matthew wrote the first birth story of Jesus, he traces in the first 17 verses of Matthew 1, he traces a genealogy of Jesus in which he includes 4 women in Jewish history. Their stories are in the Bible itself that you could go and read, and all 4 of these women were, by the standards of their day, sexually tainted women. One was guilty of incest, one was a prostitute, one was a seductress, and one was an adulteress. And then he tells the story of the virgin birth. Now, you have to ask yourself what's going on when he introduces the story in this way. There obviously were a lot of sort of rumors about the paternity of Jesus, and he writes this story, and he says in the line that produces Jesus, it had to travel through incest and prostitution and seduction and adultery. And then he tells the story of the wise men, and if you know anything about the biblical narrative, you'll know that he's basing the wise men on the 60th chapter of Isaiah, where the story is said that kings come to the brightness of God's rising. They come on camels, and they bring gold and frankincense. That sounds a little bit familiar.
Yeah, right.
People say, well, there's no myrrh in that. Well, it also says these kings come from Sheba. And if you go back into the Jewish story and read the visit of the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon, you'll find that that's where the myrrh comes into the story. The sign of a star in the east to announce an important birth is a technique that the Jews had used. You can find this in the Mishnah. They used it for the birth of Abraham. They used it for the birth of Isaac. They used it for the birth of Moses. This is a common Jewish storytelling technique. The whole world is going to be affected by the birth of this particular life, is what they're trying to say. And when you go into Luke's story, and Luke is the only other person that gives us a birth narrative, you'll find that in the story of John the Baptist's parents, Elizabeth and Zechariah, that it's a retelling of the Abraham and Sarah story. This is a post-menopausal birth. It's supposed to be quite a wonder. You have the focus is on Bethlehem. Jesus was in all probability born in Nazareth. But the messianic expectation of the Jews was that he had to be the son of David and the heir to the throne of David, so there was great pressure to move his birth to the place of David's birth, which was Bethlehem. David was known as a shepherd boy, and that's how you get the shepherds into the story. And over again, you can find these analogies that come out of the Jewish scriptures. The feeding of the 5,000, which is in all 4 Gospels, is very clearly identified with the Moses story, who fed the children of Israel in the wilderness with heavenly bread called manna. You can go through the story over and over and over again and find these things. Now, clearly, the authors of the Gospels knew that that's what they were doing. They were writing for a Jewish audience who were familiar with the Jewish scriptures, and they were wrapping the story of Moses and the story of Elijah and the story of Samuel and the story of David around Jesus to sort of indicate the power of the experience that they felt they had in him. They were not literalists. That never would have occurred to them.
So you're trying to suggest that the way that the Bible authors put these narratives together is in a better way than what the literalist explanation would give. And that's interesting to me, because I think a lot of people would say that you just don't take the Bible very seriously. and you don't take the Bible very authoritatively. It's somehow a literal, simple view of the words on the page without the meaning behind them is more true to the Bible's authority. And you're trying to argue that being a non-literalist is a better way to read the Bible rather than a lesser way to read it.
That's exactly right. In fact, I would say to read it literally reveals a profound ignorance of the biblical sources, the Jewish sources behind the gospel stories.
John, we've got a caller that I want to get on. We've got a question for you if you have a minute. So Don calling in from Warwick, New York, in fact. Don, one of the internet listeners. Hey, Don. Got a question for Bishop Spong?
Bishop Spong, how are you? It's
I'm well,
Don Heatley. We haven't seen each other in quite a few years. We worked on a few video projects together back in the 90s.
Wonderful.
Nice to be speaking with you again. Actually, my question is, I wanted to ask you, back when it used to be videotaping your lectures, I remember it was the middle of the 90s. It was the height of the influence, I would say, of the religious right. I think it was when Pat Buchanan was having some success running for president. And I remember you used to say in your lectures that you saw a time in the near future, nearer than people thought, of that kind of literalistic Christianity, or if you want to call it not so much conservative, but literalistic Christianity would really fall under its own weight. And I remember people in the audience really pushing back on that and saying, how can you say that? Look how powerful and how influential that Christianity is now. So my question is, do you see in the intervening years things changing, in particular the emerging church movement, as it's called, and some other things, perhaps in the last election, the different issues that concerned younger evangelicals and concerned older evangelicals? Do you see that change happening in traditional literalistic Christianity?
Yeah, I do.
And John, we'll only have 1 minute because of the confines of radio for you to give an answer to that terrific question.
I do see the changes, but see, I don't think any fundamentalist or neo-fundamentalist or evangelical position ever understands what the issues are. I think this country tried an evangelical imposed federal government during the 8 years of the Bush administration, and I think even the evangelicals got sick of the Bush administration before it was over. And I don't know if that means the next administration is going to be better, but we've moved away from that mentality. If you look at market share, to use a Wall Street word, the Christian church loses market share in America every year of all varieties, evangelicals, fundamentalists, and everything else. When you look at the number of people that are active in the Christian church in America, we don't keep up with population growth year by year. The Christian church is almost dead in Europe. I don't see how anybody can look locally at fundamentalism, which always appeals to people's insecurity, and say, look how our crowded churches are, and say that's the future. No, that's not the future. The future is going to be far different from that, and I hope far more profound.
The voice you've heard there is John Shelby Spong, the author of Eternal Life. If you've been interested in this conversation, you may want to pick up his book. You can also go to johnshelbyspong.com to find out more about what he's doing over there, or bishopspong.com as well. And we'll have a link for that over at Doug Pagitt Radio. Don, thanks for the call. Listeners, thanks for your contributions. And Bishop Spong, thanks for being part of Doug Pagitt Radio. Thanks for your contribution to the Christian conversation in our world. Folks, hang in there. Do the right thing. Pursue that which is good, right, faithful, and full of hope, faith, and love. We'll be back with you next week. Doug Pagitt Radio on AM 950.